Welcome to Insights, a podcast with me, Lynne O'Donnell. Today I'm talking to Sarah Adams. She's a former CIA analyst and targeting officer, which means that she hunted down terrorists for the United States government. She was involved in the coordinated militant attacks on the American consulate and CIA station in the Libyan city of Benghazi in 2012 and wrote a book about it called Know Thy Enemy. She also tracked down Taliban leaders, including one of the group's founding members, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who she tracked down to Karachi. Her CIA call sign is Superbad. Have a listen. Hi Sarah, thanks for joining me today. I guess there'll be a movie made about you sometime. Maybe you could even star in it.
No, that's okay.
I wonder if you could just start with a potted history introduction. I mean, the Benghazi attack, which led to the deaths of 4 people, including the US Ambassador Christopher Stevens, is the biggest terrorist attack, I think, against a US diplomatic mission in the country's history. And your book, Benghazi, Know Thy Enemy, sought to redress a failure to properly investigate it and bring the perpetrators to justice. But you and your co-author, Dave Benton, also join the dots, I think, don't you, tracing terrorist links through interlocking and overlapping ties that helped you gain an in-depth understanding of connections and networks that you say had been generally overlooked in counterterrorism research. It's an understanding, I think, that's integral to effective counterterrorism. So maybe you can just, as I said, start with a little bit of a potted history of yourself and your involvement in this space.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really good point that a lot of people don't understand. So when the terrorists attacked us in Benghazi, they used over 150 attackers. Obviously, now the Hamas attacks have surpassed that, right? But at the time, it was the largest attack, and it still is, on a U.S. diplomatic facility. And as you can imagine, when you look into 150 terrorists, you learn a lot about their families, their networks, and then there's historic ties. So yeah, my background comes from the CIA. I was a CIA targeter, and I was serving in Benghazi. And then in 2015, I realized nobody was going after the attackers. So me and another individual from Benghazi, his name's Dave Benton. He's featured in the movie 13 Hours. We partnered up and we did this investigation, just to lay out the networks, to figure out who's involved, to hopefully get the people watch listed, and then to hopefully get, bounties on the terrorists and get countries to go after them, even if our own country wasn't. Because as you can imagine, these terrorists went on to commit attacks in so many different places, in Mali, in France, in London. I mean, so there's so many deaths attributed to them in Syria. They are a global threat, right? And that's how we have to handle counterterrorism. The terrorists don't look at borders, neither should we.
Yes, you've called it Jihad Genealogy. Can you elaborate on that concept and its significance in tracking the next generation of terrorist networks?
Yeah, what we came across really was at first it wasn't exactly the family dynamic, it was the brotherhood of the fighter dynamic. So we started linking terrorists at our attacks based on where they trained together, maybe it being Afghanistan, or where they fought together, maybe it being the Iraq War, the Algerian Civil War, etc. In later years, obviously, the Syrian Civil War. So we started making networks kind of the brotherhood of fighters. And then as we started to identify the attackers, as you can imagine, when we found out an attacker was at the consulate, we would then hear, oh, his brother was involved, or he was there with his cousins or whomever. So then we actually did get into, kind of what we call Jihadi genealogy. And we broke down the families, one, so we actually identified the correct brother, right? Because some of these families can have, 5 to 8 brothers in them. The other part was, though, is Libya is a pretty small country, right? So if you actually understand the families these terrorists come from, you can get down to the neighborhood level and learn more background on the families, more about their parents. So then you learn, are they a second generation terrorist? Where does this come from? And then actually during that time, it actually brought us to the point where we actually identified one of the people that Al-Qaeda was going to get released. So they basically were kidnapping an ambassador to release terrorists. One was a terrorist being held in Iraq. He was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. His name is Adel al-Shalaili, and his brother then was a commander at our attacks because he was going to hold the ambassador and free his brother, right? So it was a family affair. I mean, people need to understand, that emotion behind some of these terrorist acts.
Indeed. Well, so what specifically prompted your interest in researching the familial connections among terrorists, but particularly in incidents like the 2012 Benghazi attack?
Yeah, I mean, it's the fact that we really just want to get it right. I know it sounds bad, but like, we're not in an intelligence service. This is a private investigation we run, right? So if we're going to put the name out of people who are at our attacks, I'm not going to get the wrong brother. I mean, I like that. I know it's super nuanced, but we're not going to claim someone did something wrong when they didn't, right? I mean, this is very dangerous to label someone a terrorist. And that's why we put so much focus on it, to do it right and to get the right people identified. And so we wanted to have a lot of integrity behind the investigation too. Also, so when Libyans saw it, they would know, hey, they did the job right. They did it with respect, because remember, these terrorists killed over 20,000 residents of Benghazi, right? These are their enemies too. And we wanted to show the respect to them, that we understand these terrorists, cause more of an issue to them. It's not just about our Benghazi attacks. It's about the whole situation, the Benghazi civil war, and all the people Benghazi had to go through.
And so, what insights did you uncover regarding the role of family ties in radicalisation and recruitment within the terrorist groups?
Yeah, I mean, the family angle is so valuable, right? Because the best connection I can bring up to our attacks and discuss family is, our attack was directed by the head of Al-Qaeda at the time, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. He actually gave his brother like the charge to do a lot of the planning and plotting across the different groups. His brother's name is Mohammed al-Zawahiri. So Mohammed talked to the heads of Al-Qaeda's North Africa branch, but interestingly, Mohammed was also involved in plotting the protests in Cairo that occurred simultaneously the same day, right? So it was that integrated, that the same individual was working on a terrorist attack and then working on, protests that got quite out of hand in Cairo. So I think that's really important to understand. And actually, Mohammed died just in February. He died in custody in Egypt. And they actually held a ceremony for him, and a lot of people from North Africa flew in, to include other members of the family, to Kandahar, Afghanistan, and they held a ceremony at Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri's burial place for his brother. So third generation were there, at that funeral. There's third generation in play in the Zawahiri family, involved still in terrorism. And I think a lot of people aren't paying attention to that generation now.
Well, indeed, there's also the intermarriages, the I guess it's an outward it's like throwing a stone into a pond, isn't it? The ripples go out, and over generations it gets bigger and bigger. Have you been able to, from the beginnings, this guy, his brothers, then expanded out to cousins, marriages, and how it goes?
Yeah, we've done a lot of that. One of the most senior terrorists involved in our attacks, his name is Ismail al-Salabi. He's a Libyan, but he spends much of his time in Turkey, and he does a lot of the foreign facilitator networks to fight in Syria. So either for Al-Qaeda or ISIS, he's still very involved. But yeah, we actually spent time, on his family and in breaking it down. And we found out, his sister, for example, was married to a brother, and two of his other brothers were our attacks. So that, that was three involved in our attacks. And there was multiple situations like that, as you can imagine. We had a mastermind who did an attack on our CIA annex. That was that famous mortar attack that killed the two CIA officers. We spent a lot of time on his family. He has a lot of intermarriages, which I actually was quite surprised about, because, he's one of those people we were told, oh yeah, in 2011 he'd just been a mechanic, and then he started fighting in the Libyan's revolution, and then rose up in the ranks. Well, he actually has intermarriages that predate that, right? It's like, well, maybe that wasn't the first time he put his foot into the terrorist space. So it just gave us honestly a better background to go from, to see then who historically they're connected to and where some of their power comes from, and obviously where some of their funding comes from.
Well, it must have been quite frustrating for you over the years to be hearing that Al Qaeda is a spent force, they no longer have any relationship with the Taliban, they have no presence in Afghanistan. Whereas if you've been paying attention, you know that those ties, marriage ties and then family ties, and those outward ripples that I mentioned before, you can trace them back decades, decades, which means generations as well. So was your stomach tightening up every time you heard that?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I know like all of Al Qaeda is related to all of the Taliban and all the Haqqanis, and they're all family now. And so anyone who tries to bucket
Mm,
them into separate groups, is like either they're just not caught up, but I think they're more ignoring the truth. I mean, I know there has
mm.
been a lot of misinformation that came out of Afghanistan, but there's no excuse to have it wrong at this point. But what frustrates me is, the top target of our actual personal Benghazi investigation. So he's a Libyan Al Qaeda member. He
Mm.
actually is in Afghanistan. He works in the Ministry of Interior building for Siraj Eddin Haqqani. He is married to a Haqqani. One of Siraj Eddin Haqqani's wives is his family member. And then, he's working with Al Qaeda, Taliban, Haqqanis, and, ISIS Khorasan province. So yeah, anyone who does not understand this interconnectivity doesn't want to, and they're basically covering up. And we saw this after Benghazi attacks. They did not want to admit it was an Al Qaeda attack. They definitely didn't want to admit it was a Dr. Ayman al Zawahiri attack. To this day, they still don't. And people should be concerned when they're lying about Al Qaeda, right? Because it makes Al Qaeda more powerful.
Well, indeed, and that power hasn't really gone away, and now it's back with a vengeance. I guess that's a good way of putting it. We've had reports, and I've written about it in Foreign Policy, and you've talked about it publicly, about basically the reconstitution of Al Qaeda since the 15th of August 2021. They never went away, and now they're more important than ever. But, I talk to people who now say, with ISKP, um, uh, basically raising its head above the parapet as an active organisation, especially post Moscow attack, and we're getting these heads popping up all over Western Europe. That Al Qaeda has to do something to prove itself. What do you think about that? Do you think there is okay, now prove that you're still around and you're still relevant because ISKP is getting a little bit too much oxygen that you should be taking yourself?
No, Al Qaeda actually feels completely different. Their covert operation strategy is to actually make sure ISIS gets blamed for everything. So even, they have fighters obviously in Al Qaeda, I'm sorry, in Iraq and Syria. Well, they're making
Mm.
sure anything they do there is blamed on ISIS, right? Al Qaeda wants everything blamed on ISIS to keep the heat off of them as they build out their base, get reestablished, and they do have priorities. They do have a U.S. homeland priority, right? They do have a kind of a kind of like a war plan with along the Pakistani border priority, those type of things. But they know their goals are big, and their goals aren't going to be accomplished if the U.S. comes back to Afghanistan to go after them. So they're being very strategic in
Mm.
shifting the focus on others. And one of the things they're doing to do that is they're basically covering up senior leaders who are deceased. So one of the best examples is they faked the death of Saif al-Adil's son a couple months ago in Yemen. They said he died in a fire, and really he's actually working underground, and he's like basically the liaison from Al Qaeda's Yemen branch to the Iranian Quds Force, right? So they're not just working with terrorists; they're also working with nation states like the Quds Force. So people need to be very concerned about the smart moves Al Qaeda's covert operations are making behind the scenes.
Well, that also serves the Taliban's purpose, doesn't it? Because we've got the Taliban now being portrayed as an effective counterterrorism partner with the United States.
Yeah, they kill a lot of ISKP people, but nobody ever knows any of the people they kill because they're calling, obviously, the deaths of anybody ISKP.
Yeah.
Unfortunate thing.
Yeah, well, the dynamic, what's your view of the ISKP dynamic? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any desire at government or state level to recognize a relationship, um, uh, I guess I would say a status as a beard. You know, I think ISKP is a very convenient beard, especially for the Haqqani network. I don't know, you know, it's very easy if you're thinking this in isolation to be gaslit, gaslighted, whatever the word is. What's your view of ISKP's status and relationship with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Haqqani?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at ICE-KP, they're a proxy of the Haqqani network. Now, not everything they do is for the Haqqani network, just like a lot of groups are proxies of Iran. Sometimes they do a
Mm.
operation at the behest of Iran. Sometimes they plan their own operations, and that's the same. The head of ISKP, he used to be the head of Kabul for the Haqqani network, right? And then, around 2019, Sirajuddin Haqqani said, "Hey, I need you to go basically embed yourself in, ISKP because I have this Doha deal. We're working with the US government. I won't be able to carry out attacks as Haqqani network. So I'm going to need an outlet to carry out attacks if need be. And I'm going to have to use ISKP." So that's kind of how that relationship goes. So it's just a proxy of the Haqqani network. And then when you look at ISKP and Al Qaeda, it's really interesting. They have they put up with each other, but the one thing Al Qaeda does is they basically pay them off, right? So about
Mm.
20% of the funds that go to ISKP come from Al Qaeda. Also, Al Qaeda provides ISKP with weapons as well. So there's a collaborative relationship, and those two aren't warring in any way in the region.
Yeah, yeah, it was very interesting that the style of attacks that had been immediately attributable to the Haqqani network before August the 31st were suddenly ISKP, and that's our new collective enemy because we need an enemy, don't we? Yeah,
Yes, we do. And I mean, even if you just look at the HKIA suicide bombing, right? The suicide bomber went
yep.
through multiple Haqqani run checkpoints. And people aren't being honest about that, but everybody knows the Haqqanis supported that operation. And governments are covering for them because they just want to keep this Doha deal in place. And really, people have egos and they don't want to say, we got the Taliban wrong, we got the moderate Taliban wrong, and we got played by both the Taliban and Al Qaeda in this deal.
Yep, indeed. Well, getting back to your focus on jihadist genealogy, how do you think that it can enhance counterterrorism strategies and intelligence efforts? You've been on the inside. You have come up with this term. I think you can put a little C in a circle and copyright it as your own. What's your view on its usefulness?
Yeah, actually, I think the person termed it in like France somewhere because I did see a paper titled it, and I was like, oh, awesome. I mean, after the fact,
Oh,
but
I'll use that.
so we both came up with it. I'll have to meet that person. But the really interesting part for counterterrorism, right, is there's now this second and third generation that we stayed so focused on the fathers or the grandfathers that like there is no understanding that they're involved at all, right? So I focus on Libyans. I mostly focus on our attackers, but as you can imagine, when you collect on other people. And just for Libyans, we have three very senior, well-known Libyan terrorists over the years, right? There's Abu Anas al-Libi. He was involved in the big U.S. Embassy bombings, in Kenya and Tanzania. There's Abu Yahya al-Libi, right? Who was basically the deputy to Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. And then there was Abu Faraj al-Libi, who was involved in a lot of their external operations and picked up pretty soon within the years after 9/11. All three of their sons are currently in Al Qaeda and basically senior in Al Qaeda and working on, external operations, the movement of foreign fighters. And I don't think anyone, has any sort of pulse on them, or understanding them or tracking them. And some of these men now, they grew up in Afghanistan. They don't
Mm.
have Libyan identification. They don't even have Libyan names. So I don't even know if our governments know their names. Like, the names they're living under. And we have to remember this as these generations now start coming out in Afghanistan and they're getting Afghanistan documentation, you know, 10, 20 years from now, we're not going to be able to say this is this Saudi terrorist family, right? Like we're going to think they're Afghan. And the Libyans have done a really good job of integrating themselves into Afghanistan over the last 20 years to where I sometimes have to tell Afghans, hey, that's a Libyan you're talking
Mm.
to me about. He is not Afghan. So yeah, so it's a very interesting concept that we have to wrap our minds around, or we're going to lose track of these people.
But it sounds like the losing track of them is imminent if it's not already a fact. Why has the ball been dropped? When was the ball dropped, and why has it been dropped?
Well, I have my own opinion, right? I think the ball was dropped, back all the way in Benghazi, right? At the time, unfortunately, elections in the US were going on. And one of the things they were running on is Al Qaeda's on the run. We basically defeated Al Qaeda, like we're the victors against Al Qaeda. And that was the language they were
Mm.
running on, right? So then they had to cover it up. And it kind of
Mm.
has now always been ever since, yeah, Al Qaeda's weakened. There's language even coming out now. Al Qaeda can't direct operations from its base in Afghanistan. They're like decentralized. It's like, what are you talking about? They declared a head of Al Qaeda in Africa. They deployed him. They declared a new head of Africa and Sudan. They have the Al Shabaab leader like living with them in Kandahar. Like, just this language coming out from the U.S. government, the think tanks aligned with it. It's very concerning because I'm wondering like, are they trying to be dishonest at this point? Just because there's so many people who know what's happening inside of Afghanistan. So it has been
Mm.
going on for well over a decade. It will continue to go on until people say, hey, stop this politicalization of our intelligence community, right? This isn't politicized, right? It's not an issue on either side. Like terrorism, we all should be focused on it. We should be going after it. And we should be, the facts matter in this case. Lives matter.
Well, indeed, but I do recall pre 9/11 and around 9/11, it was very fashionable to say the United States doesn't have any operatives who speak any Central Asian languages. Nobody knows what's going on in that part of the world. And I was in Mazar-e Sharif in October 2001, and there were American agents who spoke Dari, who spoke Uzbek, who were working with the Northern Alliance there, with Dostum. And it seemed to me that putting out this line that the Americans are so far removed from the reality of what's happening on the ground, that it was a way of ensuring that there was an underestimation of capacity. Could we not be in that phase again now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really good point. I have people in the U.S. military will say to me, "Oh, when I was in Afghanistan, there was like 100 Al Qaeda guys." I'm like, what are you talking about, right? Like they were even taught that, right? Like they didn't even have an
Mm.
understanding of just how big Al Qaeda was, like in their own backyard, right? I think one of
Mm.
the key underestimations right now isn't just about Al Qaeda; it's about keeping the Doha deal in place. It's about this assessment and now this relationship with the Taliban. And they're almost like cementing themselves into that relationship instead of backing up and saying like, whoa, we miscalculated. So yeah, the same thing happened in Libya. Unfortunately, in Libya we backed the side of the government who was aligned with Al Qaeda. And we still are backed with the side of the government aligned with Al Qaeda. So even 12, 13 years later, they have not gone in and fixed their mistakes. And that is a problem with governments, right? You keep the
Mm.
same people,
Mm.
like in our State Department, right? They're not filtering through. Sure, there's a new senior leader, but the people who are making these plans and strategies, they're there 10, 20, 30 years. And you're stuck with this group think and this broken assessment and now this damaged policy.
Yeah, but like you say, you have new people take over. I had a conversation with Thomas West, the US's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, within months of the fall of the Afghan Republic, I think probably still in 2021. And I said to him, I'm trying to get my head around what US policy is. I don't understand what policy for Afghanistan is. Is it that you have this geographically defined region that is now a holding pen, if you like, for every jihadist and extremist organization in the world? So you can point to it and say, we know where all the bad guys are. Because if that's not it, I don't know what else is going on. And he said to me, you know, in all the meetings that I've been in, I've never heard it quite put like that.
Which isn't surprising.
Okay, which is not surprising indeed. So how is it put? What is policy? I just don't understand what the thinking is and how you can have so many, intelligent people, amongst whom I account, if I may, you and I, who can say what's going on, and your assessment of Al Qaeda's strength and the nexus of relationships. And, it's in UN Security Council analytical team reports every few months. It's out there. Um, why the ongoing denial when the evidence just makes you look silly in keeping on denying?
Well, I faced this when I was working the Taliban back in 2009 and 2010, because that's when they decided they were going to do reconciliation. But at the time, I think the overwhelming assessment and opinion in the State Department is Afghans are going to have the Taliban as part of their government. Afghans want the Taliban. And remember, for many years, we did have sources who downplayed the Taliban. They made the
Mm,
Taliban not seem like a terrorist group, right? So part of our collection was part of the problem, right?
yeah,
Even the
yeah.
fact when we would detain senior Taliban members in Pakistan, the Afghan government at the time would ask us to release them. So do you see how this gets misconstrued within the U.S. government, as you can imagine, of this kind of sympathy towards the Taliban? And so it actually skewed everyone's belief. And then they made these assumptions. Oh, no, the Taliban are going to be in power. The Afghan people are all fine with the Taliban. And yeah, it was just a miscalculation. And it was something I was fighting at the time. And it's why they never designated the Taliban a terrorist group, right? They always viewed
Mm,
them as a political party in Afghanistan, which
mm.
is absurd. And we need to designate them as a terrorist group now.
Yeah, and you came up against that when you were tracking Mullah Baradar.
Yeah, I did. I didn't really come up against anyone holding me back from capturing him, because luckily he was top three
Mm,
of the Taliban and he was the lead operational head of the Taliban, right? So every terrorist attack or every the physical, military wise attack in Afghanistan, since he was in charge of that, they fell on him, right? So he was responsible for basically all the deaths of U.S. soldiers. So I
yeah.
didn't really have any troubles, at least trying to make him my focus. But yeah, after the fact, within the first week of capturing him, I was like, oh my gosh. And everyone only wants to ask about reconciliation. They only want to collect information on reconciliation. There's no interest in like collecting operational information to go after like the rest of the senior leadership. It was very focused on the politics of how can we use this individual for they were calling it reconciliation at the time. It obviously became this peace plan, which isn't peace either. But yeah, it was
Mm.
just this, the policy train left the station. Once Berater was detained, that's all they wanted to do is make a deal with him.
But do you think that that was possibly a recognition that there had to be a move towards a political settlement? I mean, Clausewitzian theory would have that, war is an extension of politics. This was maybe the getting back to the politics, and this was during Obama's term as president.
Yeah, it's the fact that they declared them a political party, right? And they dealt with them as a political party. And then, like you said, it was their assessment that this political party was the most powerful of the political parties. It would eventually to have a big ownership of the government anyway, and they just gave
Mm,
up and
mm.
gave into the Taliban's political party.
Well, that came later. We saw with the Doha deal that the Trump administration brokered without any regard for what Afghan people might have wanted or the true nature of the beast.
Yeah, and really that's all, like I said, that was that 10 years of State Department policy, right? Saying and dictating what the people of Afghanistan want, painting the Taliban in a light they don't belong in, and also even covering up things that the Taliban was involved in. Like the capture of Mark Frykes is the greatest example, right? Our envoys and our officials in our State Department downplayed that he was in Taliban custody. I mean, that's very concerning. And as you said, and which is the fact, the people impacted by this incompetence and is the people of Afghanistan, right? The people who didn't get a say, they didn't get a seat at the table, their opinions weren't heard, and,
Yeah.
and, and that's the most frustrating part of this. This is their country.
Yeah. Well, in your research, what is it that you aim to address? I mean, you're doing very extensive, very detailed research. Are there overlooked aspects regarding the familial connections that you're interested in amongst terrorist groups that you want to address with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to come off as a targeter, right? So I care about the families because I think I can maybe get to certain attackers through their brothers, right? So obviously, one of
Mm,
my biggest targets in Afghanistan, his name is Hamza al Darnawi. Back in the day, he used to run like the Al Qaeda electronics workshop in Waziristan. Like Bin Laden set it up, and he said, "Hey, create this new innovative way to do attacks, mostly to enhance like IEDs, because that was
mm,
the name of the game at the time, right? They were doing all the ID
yeah.
attacks against Americans. So, he
Mm,
has a brother named Mohammed. And so, right, I was like, well, if I look into Mohammed, they actually do have a very close relationship. There needs to be a way they connect. Mohammed may also travel to be with his brother, like most of these families now are traveling in, because remember, in Afghanistan, if you come in as a terrorist family, you get basically a welfare and a sustenance. So let's say I come in and I'm Hamza al-Darnawi's family. So I moved from Darna, Libya to Afghanistan. I automatically get a house. I automatically get a car. I get a monthly stipend. And then if I'm a male fighter, I basically get like a official role somewhere within the government. Obviously, the two terrorists I've talked about are in the Ministry of Interior. But then I get an official salary by the Afghan government, and I become a Taliban official in addition to being Al Qaeda, right? So there is a lot of benefit to these families to move to Afghanistan because they have a pretty good life, right? So that's the stuff I'm watching. So then maybe we can, have an opportunity to identify locations better, to identify who else of our attackers are in Afghanistan. There's obviously a lot of Libyans in Afghanistan. They have,
mm,
like I said, fake Afghan names, or they have like
mm,
kunyas, or we call them Abu names, that we just are
mm,
trying to decide, is this even who we think it is, right? To tell people,
mm,
oh, he's now in Afghanistan too. But the family
mm,
stuff is where they make mistakes, right? Because the family doesn't think they're a target, and they might
mm.
not be as operational secure as somebody like Hamza, who's very operational secure. For like 20 years, he's told anyone around him, "You take a picture of me, like I'll kill you," right? He's that level in Al Qaeda. Like you're not
Mm,
going to get that type of thing from him.
mm. Well, there has been just very recently a call by Al Qaeda to for people to come on in. Any doubts about Afghanistan having become a haven and a breeding ground and a trading ground should be dispelled. What are they up to? They're building an army. For what purpose?
Yeah, I mean, they're building an army for basically, they're building a global Islamic army for a global Islamic caliphate. I mean, that's the easiest way to put it.
Mm, mm. Well, I think a lot of people have forgotten that the first congratulations to the Taliban for their return to power came from Hamas and Al Qaeda. And incidentally, the then Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, although he likes to deny it now, but it really is, it really is, isn't it? It's we're seeing the confidence that the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan helped um, uh, inculcate in other groups. I can't imagine that Hamas didn't take a, a lot of oomph from the Taliban's return to power. And now we have Taliban figures meeting with Hamas figures in Tehran. I mean, the nexus is pretty
Mm-hmm.
clear. It's right there if we want to see it.
Yeah, and the fall of Kabul was the greatest resurgence of all these terrorist groups. I mean, people now are saying it was the Hamas attacks, but the Hamas attackers went and trained in Afghanistan prior to the Hamas
Yeah.
attacks. It was the fall of Kabul. And I think
Mm.
everything's off the table now anyway. When we saw Siraj ad-Din at the Hajj, okay, that is now the greatest resurgence of terrorism to ever occur is him being kissed by hundreds of people at the Hajj. I'm already hearing like millions upon millions of Saudi donor dollars are pouring in after seeing like that public display. That alone, right there, there's a lot of bad going to happen after seeing that, and
Mm.
how it
Mm.
has reinvigorated terrorist bases across the world.
And reinvigorated him, Siraj himself, no
Mhm.
doubt. We know that he is incredibly wily, cunning, clever, a genius, I think, probably one of
Mhm.
the cleverest people on the planet. He's playing everybody, everybody. Next stop, Caliph. Then we're all
Yeah,
in trouble.
there's only two terrorists that touched Siraj ad-Din Haqqani, right? The Qasem Soleimani, who's deceased, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's locked, wherever he is in a cell now. Like, there is
Mm.
less than a handful of people as smart in the world in the terror space as Siraj ad-Din Haqqani, and
Mm.
everybody underestimates him, and he rose to the top because of it.
Yeah, I did think about emailing the FBI. I know where he is. I'd like that 10 million bucks, please. You know.
Yeah, a lot of people have sent his location. Apparently, that
Yeah.
inbox must be broken.
It must be broken. Yeah. And we'll all get 50 cents each when the time comes.
Yay.
Yeah, really, dear. Um, can you share any notable findings of your research into second generation terrorists that might be on the not be on the radar, but who you think definitely should be?
Obviously, the most important second generation terrorist is Hamza bin Laden, right? I mean, he's the
Mm.
current head of Al Qaeda, and his brother Saad, right, the deputy head of Al Qaeda. Also, Dr. Ayman al Zawahiri's second generation children are just involved with Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, right? There's nobody talking about them, no insights into them.
No,
And then,
no.
really, the third one within that bin Laden family is Abdullah bin Laden. I mean, he's played the game like, if we talk about Siraj playing the game, Abdullah bin Laden has done a very good job of convincing the world he's not a terrorist, right? And he's basically the COO of Al Qaeda, handling all the
Mm.
finances and all those type of relationships. So yeah, second generation bin Ladens and second generation Zawahiris is who I really think we need to focus on. And then, because I'm biased, second generation Libyans, right? Because these are the cream
Mm.
of the crop. These are the people now leading Al Qaeda. And the really interesting thing is Al Qaeda's gotten very smart. So first off, Al Qaeda in Libya did a reorg. Gosh, like back in maybe like August, and they created kind of like one whole directorate that's only focused on these historic relationships, and then like basically getting the next generation ready. And then inside Afghanistan, every senior Al Qaeda leader has a mentee under him. He mentors the next generation. And a lot of those, mentees are the senior leaders or some of the deceased senior leaders, family members, right? So they're being very smart to also like develop the new leaders up, right? Instead of like, oh, your father died, you take the reins. They're like, no, you're going to be well trained. If you go into that position of power, like we're going to take that serious because we want these bloodlines to continue, and we want
Mm.
the
Mm. Mm.
leadership families to continue. Because at the end of the day,
Mm.
one of the things I learned working Benghazi is all these terrorists in Libya, they will only report to the bin Ladens. So they'll report to Zawahiri as like EIJ, Egyptian Islamic Jihad. But if you say, who do you listen to, or who do you take direction from Al Qaeda, they say only the bin Ladens. And if the bin Ladens are gone, there's no Al-Qaeda. And so we need to
mm,
understand that. It's the bin Ladens that
mm,
matter.
mm. But they're sitting, aren't they, at the right hand of the supreme leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, in Kandahar, in Afghanistan.
Yeah, they're very closely associated with Hibatullah Akhundzada, like
Mm,
brother level. So yeah,
mm,
Hibatullah, who is protecting them, but they kind of protect him too, right? I mean, all this is mutual. The biggest example though is Mullah Yaqub, right? He was the son of Mullah Omar, right? He runs the Taliban military. The Taliban military is in effect to protect, Al Qaeda. That's part of their
mm,
role and their
mm,
job, and it
mm,
matters to them.
mm. Yeah, indeed. So you basically have it's Mark II, isn't it? And Mark II also implies that we're waiting for the next big thing.
Yes, we are. And then there's going to be a third generation, right? We're going to have Osama bin Laden and Omar bin Laden. They're almost late teens. They're soon to be in their 20s. And that third generation of Al Qaeda is coming to an adulthood, too. So, yeah,
Mm.
we have a lot on our plate if we don't actually focus on the bin Ladens. And like you said, the members of the Taliban harboring them, because you can't end one without ending the other, right? They are family, they are married, and it's all one at this point.
But what we've been seeing over the past 6 or 8 months, Sarah, is the wholesale propagandization of terrorism. Terrorist organizations are being accepted across the West. Um, we have pro Hamas demonstrations in the big cities of our countries. We have young people taking to TikTok to glamorize the words of Osama bin Laden. We seem to have um, a movement that speaks to the extreme success of a PR campaign in favour of the glamorisation and wholesale societal acceptance of terrorist ideology. How the hell did that happen?
I mean, there's multiple pieces to how it happened. I mean, there's one that's so basic, but it's sad. Like Americans, or the younger generation is actually the best way to put it, love the concept of revolutionaries. I think in my generation it came from Star Wars, but then it went and it was like a Che Guevara thing. Like even the younger people wear a shirt all the time, right? And so the terrorists have been smart to say, oh, these are revolutionaries, right? Even when Iran talks, he says, this is our axis of resistance, right?
Mm,
Those
mm,
words are used and they matter. Obviously, people have talked about it, and I think it's true. I think a lot of the money that came in from the Qatari government to our universities influenced, right, the education system. I think it's a big problem. I think in a lot of different topics, people realize we need to influence the education system. And even ISIS is very smart about that. They're like, we need to be recruiting at these universities, right? We need to get the educated class, involved in backing us, right? Because that's who people listen to. That's who the people who will write things and influence things, right? So the terrorists have been very smart to know who to target, right? They don't want to be groups that are like the goat herders, or we're uneducated, right? There's videos from the Taliban. They're like, they're funny. They're like, we're very educated. There's one, he has a map in the background. America needs to understand how smart we are and how much technology we have. Like he messes up some of his words, but they
mm.
want that projection, right? They're like, we're on even par with you. And the key to doing that is bringing in the students, right? For recruitment and support, right? Remember, it doesn't matter if it's Al Qaeda or ISIS, they also want lone wolves. And so part of this propaganda is to get some of these students then to cause havoc and hopefully cause attacks in their name. It expands their global footprint. And most importantly, it brings them in donor money, right? It gets people behind their cause, and it gives them free propaganda.
Indeed, but I also think that the involvement of China and Russia is being discounted in this movement because the Russians and the Chinese have been very much um, uh, focused on undermining uh, what's widely called Western values, but I think which are human values generally, for a long time, for, 15, 20 years. I think that has been underestimated too. Do you?
Yeah, and I think that's a nuance that people need to know is very important, right? So when you see a video go viral, and a lot of our videos are serious, sadly, right? Lots
Mm,
of times it went viral, right, because of the Chinese or Russian intelligence, right? They put their bots behind it because they look at what's trending in the US, what's divisive in the US, and then they put their
mm,
basically cyber resources against it. So the majority, like probably 90% of Americans plus, have no support for these student protests, mostly in favor of Hamas, right, in our population. But because organizations and governments, within China and Russia have helped to make these things go viral and whatnot, the majority of Americans are like, whoa, like they think it's the thought of most people. It's become that way. It's like, oh, America believes this way. And then people get thrown
mm,
off when our
mm,
government policy doesn't match these protesters. It's like, no, like the
mm,
majority of our country and the majority of our government don't believe this. But yes, how it's been proliferated across the internet gives people a different view, and people really need to understand social media is like fake. It's so influenced, like you said, there's so many government actors behind, what gets a million likes and what gets
mm,
seen to you, and people need to
mm.
understand that that's also used for bad. That isn't a good thing, and that's why I'm not supportive of it, even to promote good things, right? Like health and safety. I mean, it's just too many bad actors misuse it.
Yeah, indeed. But what's the end game? It's very easy to see what is going on now, what's going on in front of us, and analyze it the way you are. But what's the end game here, Sarah?
I mean, everyone has a different end game from all the different actors we talked about in this. I mean, Al Qaeda, I mean, the bin Ladens want to follow their dad's goal and build this greater, Islamist society, right? They don't even want, the normal Muslims who don't have the extreme views within the society. It's a very, very extreme view. I mean, hopefully all the good people in the world will never let it happen, right?
Mm.
China has its own plans, but, China's plans go hundreds of years, right? I mean, just one day, their plan, right, is like the US to be like some far off province in their great kingdom. I don't even know how much control they need over us, but we're at bay, and they're the leaders, right? And then Putin in Russia, who knows with him? I mean, that
Who
guy is
knows?
like,
Mm.
to say Putin, I don't know. Like, I mean, it's crazy. Even just the whole Wagner thing, that how it went down. I mean, yeah. I mean, he had committed all this moral injury to his troops, and then he blew up the guy that said he committed moral injury. When we all died in Bakhmut. I mean, what a mess. So yeah, so Russia is just kind of like honestly messing up itself. I mean, amazingly, they still have all these other campaigns and misinformation going on, but they're destroying their military. And they're weakening themselves. And so, we kind of should just let them, because, yeah, they're on a path that it's going to soon change. He's not going to live much longer. So I don't think we know where their next 50 years is going to be
Mm.
until we know who the next person is going to be that leads them.
Yeah, that's true. If we bring it back down though to jihadism, Al Qaeda, Taliban, Hamas, these very successful, I would say, terrorist groups that are working in tandem. Um, where are they going? How do you see that ending?
They
Will it
want only
end? I mean,
one
you know,
thing.
mm,
Yeah, they want one thing: recognition, period. The near term strategy of every one of those groups is, worldwide recognition that brings in money, brings in support. It gives them their nation state. So, yeah, they want recognition. So, the way to counter that is to give none of them recognition.
but if you're talking about the Taliban in Afghanistan, I don't even know whether, we hear State Department figures and United Nations figures saying what they most want is recognition. So we're going to, pressure them on girls and women and the way they treat them. And all they do is double down. I don't
Right.
believe that recognition is their end game at all. I think it's power. I think it's money. And I've never seen a slim Taliban leader. That string in their trousers is coming out all the time. They just keep getting more and more powerful without recognition. Do they really need it? Do they really want it? Are they just not going to go out and take what they want anyway? And eventually there will be, a greater Khorasan caliphate that threatens all the other countries around. I mean, it's about power and money, isn't it?
Yeah, there's two pieces to this, right? The recognition they want is just this political standing. They don't actually care, yeah, if the UN recognizes them, right? But they want to stay in the political party lane. So even like I said, when Al Qaeda in Libya reorged, last August, they renamed themselves to a political group. So it's the Islamic Reform Movement, right? They want to
Mm,
be these movements and these political parties because really it helps them move their money, it doesn't get frozen, those type of things. They can negotiate things in other ways. But yes, all of that is their facade, right? To then build their bases, right? To take over territory, right? And then to create their
mm,
Islamic
mm,
caliphate. And when they get to that point, screw all recognition. They don't care about us. They'll be more powerful than us in their minds, and they'll have what they want. So yeah, it's just playing the game. There's two sides
mm,
to the coin.
mm,
That's their public
mm,
facing goal in what they say that they want, right? Even in Gaza, they say, oh, we want this territory in Gaza. No, they want much more than the territory in Gaza,
mm,
right? But right,
mm,
it
mm,
they want much larger region. But anyway, it's their public facing, and then policymakers like that, right? Because then they have this little thing that they say, oh, we're trying to meet this objective, we're trying to fight this want of theirs, and ignoring the larger goals, like you said, creating an army.
mm.
Huge problem, right?
Yeah.
Like we should not be
Mm.
enabling the creation of a terrorist army anywhere, right?
Well, yes, indeed. And so, what will it take for that recognition? Are we looking at another major attack that kills thousands and thousands of people, whether it's somewhere in America or Europe or Japan or Australia? Is that what it's going to take as another wake up call, history repeating itself?
I mean, that's my fear. My fear is the
Mm,
only way they're going to take it seriously. And even the US government, like, it's like the whole focus of the US government's right shifted on China, right? They want to work China, right? Like, they don't get paid to work Al Qaeda. So you
mm,
honestly have to have that happen for even resources to shift. It's like this broken system to where we aren't focusing on our enemies properly. Now, I'm not saying you choose one enemy over another, right? But they
yeah.
all need to be worked appropriately. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I think it's going to take the next attack, which is a very depressing thing. But what I like to tell people, especially in my community, I'm like, it's about preparing, right? Like, you need to prepare it if something happens, because you can't rely on your government to be here and to be safe and to stop this and to thwart this next attack, especially the one that's going to be in honor, of Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, indeed. Um, like I keep saying, and I know you keep saying too, no excuse for not knowing.
100%.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your time. It's been my privilege to talk to you today, and I wish you the best of luck with all your work.
Thank you. And thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I love all your work. I love the report you did on the mines, to hear about it, but to have no one put it out and to finally see you in foreign policy put it out, it makes a lot of us who collect this information like get excited, right? We're like, okay, someone's listening, someone's trusting, this work that different people are collecting. And, that matters. And I hope you understand how much it matters to those of us who, people think we might be a little tinfoil hat, that we're running around following our own terrorists in Afghanistan, but someone needs to do it, and someone needs to print it and put it out. And we appreciate you for that.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thanks a lot, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.